Hello and welcome to the first live show for Muscle Car Masters as we preview the 2017 event here on Blendline TV, the Sydney Motorsport Park page and the Australian Muscle Car Masters page as well on Facebook. And you can also see us on YouTube with Blendline TV. I've got Peter Doulman here with me to have a chat about his experience as a privateer in the Australian motorsport scene. A long career as a privateer, Peter, and I tell you what, a great one at that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for inviting me along. It's a pleasure to be here, especially to your first live streaming from your brand new studio. So I'm feeling quite honoured. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm glad that you could make it out here on a Wednesday night. We hope everyone enjoys it at home. We're going to be taking a look at some of the things that are coming up in Muscle Car Masters. But first, we should probably dive back a little bit into your history and where it all began for you, which was back in the back streets of Bathurst, really.
Yeah, it was really. I guess not a lot of people know that I am a Bathurstian. I grew up in Bathurst. My parents were farmers up there, so from a very early age I got to drive various bits of machinery, trucks, cars, motorbikes, tractors, anything I could find really, because it was like driving. And I joined the Bathurst Light Car Club when I was 13, which was... They didn't really know how to cope with that, because back in the day, to be a competitor, you had to hold a road licence and be 17. So they had to kind of make a category for me. And, of course, I wasn't allowed to compete until I was 17. So there was a fair bit of people turning their backs and blind eyes being turned.
The best way in some of those young motorsport categories.
Yeah, most definitely.
Would you say that some of that experience, though, with driving so young and getting involved with hill climbs gives you a lot of experience to be able to... I know you work as well with the Formula Ford guys and those younger guys coming through to give them some tips, I guess, on how to maybe control yourself a little bit, that you do have such a long time to really work through some of the things you can do?
Oh, most definitely. You know, you look at some of the kids in karting, you know, at 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age, and you see the skills they have. It's just mind-blowing how, you know, their car control, etc., etc. But starting young is definitely an advantage. And it's not just an advantage as far as driving skill goes, but it's a big advantage as far as your mental disposition, as you know, as to your attitude and all that sort of stuff. Because it's pretty, like with a lot of sports, it's pretty easy to blow up and have a bit of a tantrum. But when that occurs on a racetrack, there's a lot of speed and a lot of action involved, and it's not just as simple as, you know, giving someone a push or a shove. It ends in tears.
Yeah. That's it. I mean, you can end in some spectacular tears. I mean, we've seen some of that as well. In your career, as much as anybody else's, there's been a few spills. What was probably the biggest one that stands out for you, I guess?
Spills, you mean?
Yeah. Potentially, I don't know, maybe something more?
Well, I guess the thing about race car drivers is that what you'd call on the road as a bit of a crash or a biff, it doesn't really count. If you can drive the thing home, it's okay. So, and in fact, many a time I got asked after qualifying why I returned to the pits with both mirrors still on the car, because the crew would suggest that I hadn't really been trying hard enough. But probably in terms of accidents, I had one at Oran Park where a steering failure going across the dogleg, and the car went straight ahead into the sand trap. Mounted the wall, and I could still remember today just looking at the crowd as I was heading towards them, and I managed to stop by about one car length from going into the crowd. So that was pretty exciting for a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah, I can imagine. Seeing the crowd like that. And
Oran Park was notorious. You couldn't get out of it on Sunday evening because of the crowd and the traffic jams, but in the back of the ambulance, I got priority, so I got out quick.
Well, that's always positive, isn't it, getting home from a racetrack? I know people always struggle to get out. That's something we have when we're doing a broadcast, that trying to pack up and get out of there is often as hard as anything else. A question already on the stream, who are the young drivers that you, I guess, would like to look out for and people to watch out for who are coming through the ranks right now? We spoke about your Formula Ford involvement a little bit, and sports sedans, his heritage touring cars. Anyone from around those parts, I guess?
Yeah, I must admit, I don't have much to do with the Formula Ford guys now. I was their DSO back sort of 10 years ago, And, I had a lot of involvement with a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who race with my son. But, I guess one that I was very excited about recently was Dave Reynolds winning Bathurst.
Yep.
Because Dave was one of the kids that come through, and when I was looking after Carrera Cup, he was the young bloke there, and so had a bit to do with him. So very pleased and proud of him for his win at Bathurst. I was excited about that.
It was a great drive.
And especially excited about his restart in the wet, which we'd had a number of discussions about over the years on how to do it.
Yep. He nailed it, didn't he, to be able to get away. So obviously the discussions worked. Let's go, I guess, a bit back in time and towards your first involvement into the touring car category. What started it all for you? Because this was before V8s, this was before supercars, and before they really changed eras. What was your first foray into that?
Well, as I said, I guess, I suppose just going back a step further, I actually went to school on Mount Panorama. My primary school was on Mount Panorama. And I don't know why or what it was, but I used to nick off at morning tea or little lunch or whatever the kids call it nowadays. And because it was only a few hundred metres up to the track, and I used to sit on the strainer post on the corner. I never got very smart because I always chose the same strainer post, and the nuns would turn up 20 minutes later and take me back to school, sadly. But it was just always this, I don't remember how it happened, but I always wanted to be a race car driver, and I don't remember not wanting to be a race car driver. So it started very, very young. And as I said, then I got involved with the Bathurst Light Car Club, who were a great bunch of people and, were very keen to promote young people in motorsport. And then, I started in sports sedans. I had 2 sports sedans to start with, which a lot of people don't really know, back in a long time ago, last century. And then I went from that to Formula 2, and I had 2 Formula 2 cars, one of which I still have, which I last drove in 1995. And then John Cotter and I hooked up together because John is actually a solicitor and he was my solicitor, but we're both involved in motorsport, and he was very big in the Alpha Club. And we actually tried in 1998 to run the ex-Colin Bond Alpha 75 at Bathurst.
Yep.
But that all fell apart. It was sitting, not being used in Alfa Romeo's warehouse.
Yep.
But then that kind of got us interested enough that the following year we purchased 2 of the JPS Mobile One, Mobile Brock cars. Yeah. And so that's where that part of it started in 89, and we went to Bathurst as everybody wants to, you just want to drive at Bathurst, you don't really care whether it's win, lose or draw. As long as you get to drive at Bathurst, you're kind of happy. But the problem with it is that, we went there for the first time and lucked it in a little bit, probably with some good management, and we won the class. Yeah. And that was a disaster, really, because we just keep wanting to, go back.
Too much success is not a good thing early on, is it?
Exactly right.
I guess just before we get into the BMW years and some of the spectacular stories around that, I'd really like to talk about the Formula 2 racing, because that was such a spectacular category that people don't really, I guess, know about or remember as such. And there were some gun drivers who were fighting hard on some great circuits. I mean, we saw photos earlier of you at Adelaide racing around. What was one of those cars like on that circuit? On
the Adelaide Grand Prix circuit? Yeah. Well, again, it was the same buzz. You got to go in an open wheel race car on the same track on the same day as Ayrton Senna and guys like that, and it was just such a buzz to be there. Yeah. Adelaide Grand Prix circuit was a beautiful circuit, one of the best circuits you could ask to drive on. Yep. The Clipsal circuit now is also a very, very good circuit, but particularly hard work because of the heat it's a hot environment anyway in Adelaide, but the heat builds up in the concrete jungle. So whenever you've done a race at Adelaide and you get out of the car, you certainly know you've done one. But Formula 2 cars, they go okay. They've
okay. They're cars some of us could dream of driving for the power.
They're not like a Formula 1 car, but but it's the same sensation, the same sort of grip levels, and I guess probably hurts as much if you hit the wall.
I can imagine. Well, who was probably? I mean, it's hard to say out of all those people who were involved, but who would you say was the best and toughest competition in that category?
In Formula 2? Well, look, for one season, Cedo drove in Formula 2, Glenn Seaton. You had guys like Rowan Onslow, and a lot of drivers that never really went much further, but were very, very talented drivers and probably should have gone along further. But it was coming off the end of, the John Smiths and the John Bowes and all those sort of guys, you know, and, guys like Mark McLaughlin, he was there in a little Elfin car, which was beautiful. It went good. So, lots of guys that probably never come through that maybe should have, to be honest.
I guess it's as much as anything, like we look back on how great it was in that era that you could step through, but it was still a difficult pathway in motorsport. There's still, in some regards, many of the issues you have now with money and finding sponsorship, even though it wasn't the same amount of money that you needed back then, it was still similar in the hardness of getting those gigs.
Yeah, I don't think that's changed at all, I think it's just all relative numbers, You still need the same kind of money. The tyres are relatively the same cost. The engines are still relatively the same amount of money. The entry fees. So I think it's just the same thing, just in a modern number,
Well, we've got Dave Atkin on the stream wanting to get onto the BMW. He's, of course, a big BMW man himself with sports sedans. So
Hi, Dave.
Thanks to Dave, he's pushing us along here. But I guess, that is the next logical step. The BMWs, which we have some pictures of, that you've supplied, and we've also got from Ray Birchhouse with the Muscle Car Masters magazine, a partner of the 2017 Australian Muscle Car Masters. Some brilliant photography from back then, but what was it like? I mean, you won the class first time out, but what was it like to roll up in a car you just bought, previously run by Brock and the Mobile team, and to get out there and really have that experience that I guess you could imagine was like 88?
It's hard to explain, really. I suppose I maybe just go back to the beginning of that story. We'd only had the cars for a couple of months when we went to Bathurst, and we're probably fortunate that we had no idea what we're doing, because you wouldn't necessarily do it if you did. But we were really lucky with the way the whole deal come together with the cars. BMW owned the cars, but Peter Brock owned the spare parts, and there was a bit of, I think a bit of an impasse with those guys. But because we had a relationship to some degree with both of them, and this is part of the racing culture that was around in that era, those guys were always keen to help newcomers and to help privateers and to help young guys get a foot up. And Alan Gow, when he was working with Peter Brock, and Pete himself and Mort, they gave us a tremendous amount of assistance, enormous amount of assistance with those cars. We just, and not only in terms of the equipment they supplied us with and the time and the help and the input, and likewise BMW, they gave us quite a leg up as well, and we put that together, and it all started from there. So, I guess we lucked it in a little bit the first year, but every year after it got a lot harder. Yeah.
I mean, you still, from what the stories say, you had a great amount of fun those years in the late 80s, early 90s with those BMWs. Was it because the cars were, I guess, more manageable than they are today, in the sense of you could rip an engine out and make a change and get back racing, and it didn't require so much infrastructure in electronics and all of those extra things, that you could actually still have a bit of fun with your racing?
I'm not so much sure that it's that. Certainly, I'd been around a lot of race teams prior to that, and I saw a lot of people that were too intense, and probably a bit up themselves, to be honest. And I decided that I liked motor racing so much that why would you want to go and do something you love so much and be grumpy and uncomfortable about it? So. And I was fortunate with John Cotter, because he was, the ultimate best teammate. And we just basically had a deal that if we ever got to the point where this becomes so hard or so difficult, or we weren't enjoying it, we'd stop doing it. So we used to just go and have a ball. And we had a great crew and team with us, and they were all the same. We all had the same attitude, So, we could work all night, but, 7 o'clock in the morning, we'd be still laughing.
That's it. Well, I mean, trying to laugh after working all night like that, maybe it was delirium that had you going at that stage. What was the best race in those BMWs for you? I know you took out the 92 2 litre championship. What was I guess the pinnacle for you?
There's so many moments, like it just, dozens. But I suppose the one that probably sticks in my mind the most was a race at Winton, and Phil Ward was in the Mercedes at the time. And Phil and I raced, and I don't know what length the race was in those days, but it was probably about an hour. And we raced absolutely door handle to door handle, and I don't know how many passes we made on each other, but we still come across the line at the end of the race, half a car length apart, as it was from lap 1 and every single lap thereafter. But it was just, normally you get a bit of a break in a race, even if you're having a close race, but that race was just full on from start to finish.
And what position were you guys racing for?
Well, in our class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that was back in the day when we had, the class set up. And so you had later on you had then your V8 supercars and your 2-litre cars together.
I guess when the V8 supercar transition happened, you continued with the BMWs, took them to 2-litre specification for racing that. I was watching some footage earlier, and they mentioned that you guys really made a commitment early to do that. What was behind that? I mean, you already had the BMWs, but did you, I guess, expect that the 2-litre class would continue to be something supported by the bigger V8s, or was it the writing on the wall very early that it wasn't going to last very long, and you were just trying to make the best of it at that point?
No, I don't think the writing was on the wall. We thought that I suppose a little blindly, because we'd always had class cars in the Bathursts and places like that. So we thought the natural progression was going to be V8 supercar and 2-litre, and particularly when the series came up with a separate race for the 2-litre cars, and we thought, well, this is going to get a lot of opportunity. People like watching these cars, etc., etc.
Yep.
So we did make the decision to go down that road, and we were very seriously pioneers, because our racing in Australia started well before Europe.
Yeah.
And again, we did everything ourselves in our own workshop down at Silverwater, and we built the 2-litre engines, and we dynoed them, and we programmed them, and we did all the bits and pieces. And as I said, we had a tremendous bunch of guys there that were helping us and working hard, but Simon Copping and myself and a few other guys, we had the engines up and running, and at one stage BMW Germany were inquiring to see what we'd done with the engines to get where we had.
How do you take a call like that? What goes through your mind when BMW Germany calls up and says, hey, we want to know to help our program? Because we've heard it with the Dick Johnsons with the Sierras and the Nissan guys with the GTR, but to hear that you guys as a privateer team also had a powerhouse calling you for information, that really shows the depth of Australian motorsport.
Yeah, I think so. And it just comes out of the blue. So, you just try and understand the accent.
So what were they after? What was the...
Well, I really wanted to know what we'd done initially, and what bore and stroke we were using, and what camshafts we were using. I mean, clearly they'd obviously almost done exactly the same as us.
Yeah.
It's just we were 3 months ahead of them, so we were just the next iteration above them. So I think they were just trying to claw back the 3 months.
Yep.
But coincidentally, the bore stroke and the engine arrangement that we finished up with and used in the end happened to be exactly the same one they used all over the world.
Yeah, right. So they just happened to end up at the same place you did.
They probably stumbled on it like us.
I was going to say, did they send anybody out to Bathurst 1990 to find out or something?
They probably just ripped up a few $100 million and stumbled on the same result.
Privateers can do it just as well.
Well, we were running our own show. We have our own automotive business in Silverwater. We're building our own engines. We're prepping the cars. We're doing the whole lot. And, we took on, we really didn't get a lot of assistance from BMW, I'm sorry to say. We probably should have got more. Although I'll hasten to add that Frank Gardner and Tony Longhurst and the guys at Benson and Hedges and Coke did give us a lot of help, and fabulous guys.
Yep.
But Germany was perhaps not so forthcoming. But in the end, we took on a Japanese car manufacturer backed by a major oil company with a very well-known race team, and we beat them.
Yeah, that's it, and that's what it's all about. Like that Aussie battler spirit
Yep.
is alive and well in the privateers. What do you do running out of a small workshop in Silverwater to get these cars prepped? I know you said it's a long hours and things like that, but how did you guys get yourself to all the events and then the big one of Bathurst and actually run the cars successfully enough to be, at the front of your class every time?
I don't know.
I was hoping for a bit more depth of an answer.
I think it's just sheer bloody determination.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we worked lots of nights and all sorts of things, but I guess the thing I'd like to go back and say is there were probably about half a dozen or 8 core people who helped us, and we didn't have any full-time employees as such. We did later on, but all these guys were blokes who'd knock off work and come down to the workshop and work till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And I think it was just we had so many people that we gave them areas of responsibility, and they all knew it had to be done perfectly, and they wouldn't go home till it was perfect.
Yeah.
And I remember the wheels on our cars, for example. Everybody was having issues with wheels coming loose and wheels leaking and all that kind of stuff. And we went to the wheel manufacturer and said, "Why is this happening?" And they said, "Because people aren't, preparing the wheels and looking after the wheels properly." And we said, "Okay, show us." So we had one guy, hey Fabio, we had one guy named Fabio, and he was just an absolute dedicated to the nth degree on the wheels. Every wheel was perfect. They're like his children.
Yeah.
And he knew them inside out. And we never had a wheel come loose, and we never had a wheel leak.
That's incredible just to see, like, you give people the opportunity to have an area that they own and they will pick it up and run with you, and because they believe in the privateer
and the
mentality,
knowledge,
they'll gain the knowledge and
Yep.
away you go.
Yeah.
Staying on the BMWs, we spoke a little bit before we came on air tonight about the 92 Bathurst. Of course, that's one that really stands out for a lot of people's mind in that era. It was the end of Group A, start next year of the V8 category, and then that dismal mountain event where the red flag happened. What was it like from your perspective as a privateer, battling those elements, trying to get the car to the finish? You were in amongst it just as much as everybody else. Can you explain that race a little bit and just give us some of the idea of what it was like for not being a top runner?
Well, I guess a couple of things I'd say is after the most recent Bathurst a couple of weeks ago and the just appalling conditions the guys were in, I had some sort of nightmare flashbacks to that time. And it's, it's what the guys were saying, at Bathurst recently, that you just don't get a break. The level of concentration is just to the point where your eyeballs pop out of your head, but combined with the fact that you can't see. The screens are fogged up. They were talking in the race commentary about using the squeegee and, been there, seen that, done that. But even when you got a screen that you're saying, how good's this? I've got the best screen. If it was in road conditions, you'd be whinging like crazy because you couldn't see.
Yeah.
So a bad screen for road conditions is a great screen for racing. I guess for 92 in particular, we were very fortunate that we're driving the M3s because, although they're quite a peaky little engine car, they're just the most beautiful and forgiving car to drive. Like, I've raced open wheelers, sports sedans, V8 supercar, etc., and people say to me it was the best car you ever raced, and it's the M3 by a country mile.
Yeah.
And you had this very personal relationship with the car, and you could push the car and you'd push it over the limits, and it'd just sort of squirm or be a bit silly, and it was kind of like, well, don't do that again. It's like, oops, sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, very forgiving little car.
Yeah.
All race cars are hard to drive at 10/10ths.
Yeah.
But if you made a bit of a mistake, it'd look after you.
In that era of 92 and the early 90s, late 80s as well, we did see after 87 with the World Touring Car event, we still saw a few of those international teams come out. Did you get a lot out of that, being able to pit yourself against some of those teams that were probably, you'd seen running in Europe throughout the year, and then here they are at Bathurst and you get a chance to see actually how you compare against them? What does that do for for a small group like you guys who are really like, I guess in many regards you could term ordinary Australians out there racing?
Yeah, it's probably more for your morale and your ego than anything else, because when you do run with them, you find that, yes, you match them, and often in many ways, particularly in technical or, pit stops or pit crew and things like that, you think, wow, we could actually teach these guys a little bit.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's pretty cool,
Yeah, exactly. To be able
Very
to
rewarding.
run in front of them must be incredible.
Yeah, to run in front of them, and we were fortunate back in that era that where you could run T cars, and because we had 2 cars, we were one of just 4 teams that actually run T cars at Bathurst. So sort of pretty elite level, and we were one of the finalists in the pit stop competition. And whenever you're up against the HRTs or the big teams or international teams, and these bunch of blokes from down in Silverwater run in the top 4 pit stop competition. That's not bad.
Would you say that the element of that chat has changed now in the sense of but it's a lot harder to be a privateer at that top echelon, and the access just isn't really there? What would you say people need to do now if they want to be able to, I guess, try to get that experience like you had as a privateer driver and still be able to compete on some of the higher levels?
Well, sadly, in that elite level, the V8 supercars, you can't do it anymore. And in fact, it was even pretty much the case with Formula Ford when my son ran Formula Ford in sort of 2007, 2008. You really had to be part of the bigger teams then to be successful, just with the data sharing and the information and all the rest of it. So it's pretty tough for, privateers, if you like, coming through. And I guess that's why we're seeing, a lot of the privateers, for want of a better word, going into categories, like maybe even Carrera Cup and things like that, or GT. The GT category really is the old privateers to a large degree,
Yeah.
So they've just found another place to play because the big blokes don't want them there anymore.
Well, there's obviously people out there who like you, because Dan Holohan's written in to say Pete's a good bloke, and so is his son, of course, a Formula Ford competitor who's having a reasonably strong year for pulling back a little bit. I'm sure you're keeping track of his progress as well.
Yep.
Jamie McDonald, thanks for watching, has asked, what's the best looking car that you've had? And I have a feeling this is going to lead us into our next area of discussion, because I have a feeling I know where this one is.
Well, at the risk of being a tad biased, the Gatorade VT Commodore, VT VX Commodore, was not only the best looking car I had, but I believe it is still the best looking car that's ever been on the circuit. Ever been on the circuit.
That might spark a bit of controversy in the chat. Let's see if anybody thinks there's a better looking car out there. Now, you had some good runs though in that car as well. That Gatorade car, aside from putting in the wall at Oran Park, which we sort of covered off a little bit earlier, there were a few decent drives in that one for you blokes to really get it up there. I saw in one of the early races, I think it might have been Oran Park, you were 27th out of 40 cars, which is phenomenal numbers for V8s. But to be 27th and right up the front of the privateer group, where you're up against the Malroses and the Terry Finnegans and those guys who were, in their own right, very quick as well in the right equipment, it just shows how incredibly tough it became in that earlier era.
Yeah, well, that's true. And of course, the other thing you need to remember about that era was that there was a tyre war on.
Yeah.
And, whether you were running a Dunlop or a Bridgestone or what have you, but...
Gatorade cars up now.
The Gatorade car. But the privateers never had access to the good tyres.
Yeah.
So, if you got, like you said, to that front pointy end on a customer tyre rather than the contracted team tyre, you'd done a very, very good job. Because, often you could pinpoint what the tyre was worth, and if you added that to your time, you'd think, I'm up in the top 5 cars here, sort of thing. I think it was 96, I can't remember, it's last century, but the privateers were the first group to go to control tyres, and it was an experiment to see if a control tyre would work for V8 supercars. and we run a Dunlop control tyre, and of course it was incredibly successful. The tyre was a bit slower than a reasonable amount slower than the other Dunlops that were being used by the front running, like the Larrys and people like that. But it meant we're all on the same tyre, and we're very happy and very excited about that. And we actually had a shootout at Bathurst in qualifying on that control tyre, and which I'm pleased to say, and I can't remember the margin, but it was like 0.004 of a second that I won the pole shootout at Bathurst.
So you got your own lap of the gods then.
Yep, and anytime you've got a trophy in your cabinet that says pole position Bathurst and your name on it, that's one you keep. I was
going to say that's got to be a pretty big deal. Now I know with those privateer cars as well, not only the supercars started to go towards, of course it eventually became Project Blueprint and all of those efforts to keep the cars comparable to each other. But I remember when I was a kid watching the early 2000s, the late 90s Bathurst, and there was a discussion on there when there used to be the Privateers race as well. I think you had a 100-kilometre race on your own a couple of years in a row, or maybe 30 laps or something like that, like a stint, I feel like I remember. And they discussed the idea that when some of those cars were measured, the wheelbase had changed by a matter of inches on certain cars, and chassis rails were completely different to what the top spec cars had been when they bought them. How much does that change? I mean, I know we watch Formula One and things like that where finite details make such a massive distance. How much does that as well affect you guys as privateers when you're just trying to run these cars and keep them going?
Yeah, well, all sorts of stuff happens, and normally, you have a crash or hit a wall or something like that, but you don't have the opportunity to take it back and put it on this precise jig with, 10 guys crawling all over it and measuring, etc., etc. If you're lucky, you take it down to your local panel shop because he's a good bloke and he fixes it cheap for you, or if you're lucky, like we were in the case of Bradley Smash and Silverwater Smash, they fix it for free for us. But of course, you don't have race car engineers working on it. You have your regular day-to-day panel beaters, and things get a bit out of whack, etc., etc. But I guess that's one of the reasons we had a lot of success is that we were extremely pedantic about making sure the car was, square, straight, spot on. And we'd spend hours and hours and hours just making sure it was right.
I've got a question from Mark Russell. Did the Konica Series level the playing field?
For the privateers, I guess it did, because I suppose it was sort of that iteration that gave it the Privateers Cup, became the Konica Series. Although from day one, the professional teams were running cars in the Konica Series. So if you look back at the guys who won the Konica Series, they were by and large pretty good young drivers, but they were driving the same machinery as somebody else was driving in the main game.
Back in those privateer days, they also had the Privateers Cup, as you mentioned, and they were doing a lot of things to draw starting positions out of hats and things like that. Did that affect you guys mentally in the sense of just not feeling like you were being taken seriously as competitors on that big stage?
I don't think it affected us from that perspective. I think we understood that we were trying to make good TV and a spectacle and attract the crowd, but it was disappointing, and it did affect you a little bit in that, if you had a good car that was quick and you're supposed to be up the front, but you had to start in position 10 or something like that, the risk, and you hear the top guys talking about even today, but the risk in being involved in an accident in the first 2 or 3 corners at the start of the race was a huge problem. And even a bigger problem for us, because it's one thing to destroy an expensive car, but it's another thing when you don't have the budget and you've got to take it home yourself and do it.
Yeah, I think I saw one of the ones where you were drawn out of the hat was a wet Simmons Plains. You started at the front, there was a bit of wheel spin, but then you immediately got barged wide by all of these guys just dive bombing into turn 1 at Simmons Plains. That mustn't have been a great experience as a privateer when all of these guys also have to repair their own cars.
Yeah, that's really the problem, and I suppose, when my son Grant started racing, it was one of the things I tried to take out of the equation for him, that basically win the race, and if you bin it, I'll fix it, and don't worry about it, because always in the back of my mind was 2 things: if I binned it, I had to fix it,
Yeah.
and I also had to pay for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was like a big deal.
Speaking of that with Grant, just going off topic slightly, there's a story that I think would be fun to tell a little bit if you're interested. We want to make Grant feel a little bit embarrassed. What happened with him on a certain warm up lap at an event in a Formula Ford?
So it was here at Sydney Motorsport Park, called Eastern Creek in the day. I can't remember how old he was, maybe 16, not very old, 16, 17. We had an older car. He was on his home track. It was around at the National Formula Ford Championship. He thought, and we thought, he had a pretty good chance of running up the front. And he was also very good, or is very good in the wet. And so it was a wet race, and we'd instructed him to go out and get as much heat into the tyres as he possibly could on a wet track. So he was doing everything from wheel spinning to diving to weaving to whatever. And he came down into the old turn 9 and just looped it in the wet, not very fast. It slid down the grass, wouldn't stop sliding on the wet grass, into the wall, and demolished a corner of the car on the warm-up lap. So he was not that excited about it, pulled his steering wheel off and hurled it with disgust. It hit the concrete barrier and bounced straight back and hit him in the helmet, whilst all being captured on national TV.
Which tells you should probably never get too carried away with that. We're going to skip across to another young driver who's doing great things, Luke King, in the Toyota 86 series. I know you know Luke quite well. You support him in the 86 series, and he has been doing a fantastic job in many regards, in the same battler spirit as you had back in the 80s, in the sense of he hasn't got the great backing. Go check King Racing out, because he's doing some amazing things to try to keep himself going. But he says if Pete could choose any team and any co-driver from his era, who would he drive for and who would it be with? Most importantly, why?
Wow, that's a tough one, Luke.
He's really thrown you a curveball. He also said to point out that you should finish the sentence every corner every. So there's a joke there, obviously.
No, that's not a joke. I've known Luke since he was quite young, and unfortunately I may be somewhat responsible for him being involved in this silly game. And since he first started racing, he said, give me one piece of advice. And I said, mate, the best piece of advice I can give you is every corner, every lap. So a lot of guys go out and they'll cut a fast lap. Advice. And they're kind of parading around going, hey, look at me, I've just set a lap record, and the next 3 laps are rubbish. Yeah. And of course, the bloke who wins the race is the one that's head down and just keep banging out fast laps. Yeah. So it's every corner, every lap. He obviously remembers that.
Yeah, he's kept it on board.
To answer your question, though, Luke, the co-drive is very simple. It would either be John Bowe or Larry Perkins. Yep. And team-wise, probably Larry's team, because I guess we knew the most about Larry's team because we had 2 Commodores, both were Perkins Commodores, and when we first got our first Commodore from Larry, he, and I can't use the words he used because if you know Larry, they're always descriptive, but he basically said, if you don't muck around with the car like a lot of people do and think they know better, if you leave it the way I give it to you, I will be able to help you. And we took that on board, and that was true. And he was true to his word. You know, he helped us enormously with information, with data, with setup, you know, and obviously spare parts and all that kind of thing.
Yep. And kept you going.
Kept me going, and in fact, when we first moved across from the BMWs and we were looking at buying a Larry car, you know, there's all this talk about who gets the best engines and who doesn't get the best engines and all this sort of rubbish. And I was quizzing him and I said, well, you know, how do I know that if I pay you the money, you're going to supply me with the best gear? And he said, well, it's really easy, Peter. He said, because if one of my cars pulls out and overtakes me down the straight, he said, I sell more cars and I sell more bits. And I said, well, yeah, that's fair enough. But then he added, but don't worry, you won't. And I said, why is that? And he said, Because I'm a better driver than you.
Well, I guess straight to the point with that one to get
Always knew where you were with Larry.
That a lot of people, the Formula One talks as well with the engine supply and things like that. That people do forget that, don't they? That you really do need to supply customers with just as good equipment as you're using yourself, because otherwise the customers do end up just walking.
Yeah, I think that's true, but you'll be surprised how often it doesn't happen. It's just crazy, There's, and some of the drivers, I guess, in Formula One, have got egos big enough to demand that they get the best of this or the best of that, etc., etc. And in fact, just talking about Larry, we had exactly that scenario with an engine where we were waiting for our engine to come back. It had been to Larry's for a rebuild and an upgrade, and it had been on the dyno. I rang the engine builder and said, "Come on, what's happening with the engine?" And he goes, "I think you better talk to Larry." And I said, "Like, what, you blowing it up on the dyno or something serious?" And he goes, "Ring Larry." So I rang Larry and I said, "What's happening with my engine, mate? Like, I need it. Come on, we're going." And he just burst out laughing. And he said, "No, the engine guys don't want to send it to you because they've just rebuilt it, give it all the updates. It's got 7 horsepower more than our best engine. They want to keep it." He said, "I just rang him and told him..."
Already had his eyes on Bathurst, obviously.
Well, no, and Larry said, "I've already rang him and told him, ship it."
Yeah.
He said, like, it's, So
see, that's fascinating to hear for people like myself, and I'm sure many others on the stream, to know that people like Larry, who is renowned for being a strong and fierce competitor, always focusing on Bathurst. I mean, I've met Jack in a lot of travels with sports sedans, and he's always been very personable and open to everybody. Like, to hear that Larry, even at the peak of his game, was willing to help people like yourself is incredible, because I just don't think you'd see it across the top echelons these days.
No, you don't, and that's the thing. And people say to me, do you miss being involved in that? And I don't really, because the politics when I finished was just getting so bad and all that kind of stuff. I mean, do I miss hopping in a race car and having a drive? Yeah, sometimes I do. But I certainly don't miss the politics. And, that's one of the things that's gone across the sports sedans now, and the guys all help each other. And that's how it should be. It's a sport, it's not a...
Yeah. You were mentioning earlier that a lot of these guys also have come back to that feeling of, and we don't need to mention names, but that feeling of even people they were fierce competitors against, they've come to be friends with since passing out of that political environment. So I guess it shows that really that charged environment is not where we're all meant to be, that there's become too much associated with it.
Absolutely, and I think you see that in Formula One as well, but the motorsport community is such a small group of people that we need to look after each other and help each other and hang out together, because it's just a tiny group. And I mean, there are people I've raced against that I didn't like that much, but now that I've stopped racing, they're actually really nice people. I like them.
That's interesting, isn't it? Quick question. Rob Woolard has said, "What was your favourite track bar Bathurst?" So quickly we'll get that. That's going to be a tough one, because you raced in an era of some of the great tracks with Oran Park, Amaroo, the original Adelaide Street Circuit.
Yep.
I guess you're not short on pickings to be able to choose what you want to have.
I'm not, and Rod's right. Probably should exclude Bathurst, because 1, Bathurst is Bathurst, and 2, I'm a Bathurst boy. But to be honest, and it's a question I've been asked many times, when I was racing professionally, I worked incredibly hard at having no favourites.
Yeah.
The reason for that is that, and you still hear it amongst people today, this is a good track for you, blah, blah, blah. If you let that mindset get into your head, you'll say, "Oh, well, we're going to race at Symmons Plains this weekend. I always go bad there." And sure enough, you'll go bad there.
Yeah.
So I always made a very strong point of not having any favourites. It was just another piece of black bitumen. It was just another corner, and you just got on with it and went as hard as you could.
Quick question for you from the own top of my head with your privateer experience, and since we've had people like Dan Holohan and Luke King right in, who are young blokes trying to make their own way through it, and there's multiple like them, what would you say is your best piece of advice for all of the young people out there to get themselves seen and acknowledged on where they want to go? Because it's a hard market. I mean, I watched the Bathurst coverage, using Luke as an example, because again, up front, I'm friends with him and follow his process closely. He was at the back of the field. He drove through the field in a tough 86 field up into just outside the top 10. No coverage. But cars that didn't get as far through the field because they were the leaders, and of course as well probably have a bit more put into the category, got a lot more coverage. So what do these guys need to do, in your mind, to get some of those? Because you got called for some big deals. We'll talk about them in just a minute. But you got seen by just being there and plugging away. So what would you say they need to do?
Well, and we spent a lot of time, you know, talking to the right people, and this is still true today. You know, making sure you're getting coverage, etc., is largely about networking, and you know, using Luke as an example. You know, he works pretty hard at that, and he does a pretty damn good job.
Yeah, definitely.
And if you look at his stuff he puts up on Facebook, it's pretty good and it's pretty professional, and sometimes it's interesting.
There you go,
Sorry,
Peter Doulman with a lot of help.
Sorry, Luke. I think it's important you get into a category that's going to get, you know, the right sort of coverage, and I think Luke's, you know, onto it with the Toyota 86. I think it's getting good coverage. And you just need to be up the front. You just need to keep banging away, you know, on every corner, every lap.
Yep.
And it does, you know, no matter how hard it kicks you, you just got to come up punching. You just got to come up punching. As Peter Brock used to say, bite off more than you can chew like hell.
That's it. I remember that saying very much. I guess Ian Vaughan has said, is the club level sport the base for the true enthusiast now? Is that the real land of, I guess, people who want to be involved?
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about that. You know, and I worry that club level and state level now, probably more than anything else, is the true motor racing for people who want to race. But you know, I think there's, you know, even some of the state level stuff struggling a little bit. It could probably do with a bit more help from the promoters and the circuit owners and from CAMS and a few others, because club level racing is motor sport, and you know, whatever we're doing with V8s and all that sort of stuff, or V6s, is, you know, a professional advertising business.
That's a good segue into the next little bit of topic, because we're running out of time rapidly here. The hour's passed incredibly quickly. There's so much more we could cover.
So much fun.
But exactly, like, there's some amazing stories that happen behind the scenes. But I guess the one that I want to get to is one we spoke about that just, it blew my mind, because I hadn't heard the story before, and so many people idolised that team and the cars. How close you came to being the JPS BMWs?
I have a lot of good stories.
Yeah.
Some of them are true.
This one just is incredible, and I think people will be blown away to hear.
Well, I can only tell our side of this story because I wasn't privy to boardroom information, etc., but there was something happening in the early 90s with Amatel and Coca-Cola Amatel, and Frank Gardner was running the Diet Coke cars and the Benson and Hedges cars. And as I said, I don't really know the full story here, but Frank came to us and told us that he needed to separate the two teams. For some reason, maybe it was because, you know, cigarette advertising was on the outer and they didn't want that mixed with the Coke. I don't know. I presume that's what was happening. But he basically asked us if we could take over the Benson and Hedges team, and John Cotter and myself run it, which was like winning the lottery. We was like, wow, seriously? And he said, are you up for it? And we said, we're up for it. And he goes, good, because I think you're up for it too.
Yeah.
And that was a discussion we had at Sandown with him. And the next week I got a call from one of Frank's I don't know, media or marketing people or something, and basically said, take your suit to work and be prepared at a couple of hours' notice to get to a board meeting on this decision. So I went off to work happily with my suit, thinking by lunchtime today I'll probably be a factory BMW racing team.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, it never happened, and they kept the two teams together.
Yeah. But I guess that is such an inspirational story, even though it didn't materialise. To have, that's like having a Roland Dane or Walkinshaw turn around to you as underfunded in many ways, battling away team, doing it all yourself, and say, I think you guys can be this, and them give you all of, not give you, but, be part of making it happen for you, to be looked at like that, that's got to fill you with so much confidence and pride into future years as well.
Well, it did, and I guess particularly coming from Frank, because Frank was sort of the godfather, the granddad, the good bloke, and he was an amazing human being. And he'd had so much success overseas, and was so highly regarded by Ford and BMW and people like that basically whatever he said they'd agree with, sort of thing. And to have him put that stamp on you was that was pretty cool.
I can imagine. I guess rounding it out a little bit, in your career, toughest competitor across the V8, let's say, era, rather than the BMWs. We've already talked about the drive with Phil. Toughest competitor in Privateer Cup. Who would not give you an inch? You looked forward maybe to racing, or found them very difficult?
They're all the same.
Everyone's the same.
Toughest competitor. No, they're all pretty much like, none of them would, a lot of them, we were friends, we were mates, etc. But once you got in the car, that was it. Like, it just, forget it, whether it be Steve Reed or Trevor Ashby, Phil Ward, Mark Poole, all those guys, which I knew quite well. Pooley was my teammate at when I drove Formula Holden. We were quite good mates. But, in the car, God, there was nothing. Like, there wasn't an inch.
That's always good.
Yeah, no, they were all tough. Yeah. All tough.
Before we get into Muscle Car Masters, we'll just plug a thank you to Australian Muscle Car Masters. You can get some merchandise for the event from the Australian Muscle Car Masters website, musclecarmasters.com.au. Some great merch coming up. In 2 weeks' time, we will be live for 2 days here at Sydney Motorsport Park, bringing you every race and qualifying session, as well as plenty of pit activity. So make sure you join us in 2 weeks' time. We're going to be doing a live show next week as well. We've got a special guest lined up for that one. We're not revealing who it is. We want to get some engagement and chat around that one. But the Muscle Car Masters, a great event, and I guess really does go back to what we've just been talking about with the camaraderie, the access, and the ability to just go racing with mates. What, for you, is the standout about Muscle Car Masters?
Well, to a large degree, I guess because the Group A and C car, the heritage cars, are here, and that is the era.
Some of your old BMWs will be here.
In fact, the two cars that John and I run are there. Sadly, they're now worth a fortune, much more than we sold them for. But it's just so good to see those cars, and they're beautiful things. And I have an involvement with those guys. And, as we say, you never really get to own the car. You're just the custodian of a piece of art, so you've got to look after it. This year, of course, we have the sports sedans running, which my business partner, Simon Copping, will be running in. And, of course, Simon was always my crew chief, and he was the guy who helped me do the engines and all that sort of stuff in the day. So, and he cranks pretty hard, and he goes all right in that car. Yeah. So
he's been driving the wheels on.
There's nothing left. There's nothing left at all.
I think something to talk about with the sports sedans as well is we're in a real transition phase with them. The Nationals have joined the State Series for the last season. It's produced some great racing. We've got a lot of it on Blendline TV to spook ourselves. I really enjoy watching it. Go back and watch some of it before we get into next weekend, because it will give you a real rundown of where things are at. But notably, a New South Wales competitor at state level, to continue this privateer theme, only started racing Division 1 a couple of years ago and may be able to take out the crown. Now, he's been aided by Jack Perkins, had a massive mechanical failure with the engine blowing at Phillip Island last round. But still, to be able to capitalise on those pro moments, you have to be there, and he's there, and he might be able to take this home.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've got to be there or thereabouts, and you've got to be knocking on the door, because you've got to have built the points up, And I'm sure he's had some days where he hasn't scored enough points as well. So,
he went off 3 times on
twice
on Jack's oil at the last round
and
lost points from it. So
absolutely, and he had a noise issue. So Billy, I think he's doing a great job, you know, and the bar for the New South Wales sports sedans is quite high now, where at a state level we're basically running national category times.
Grant's right in amongst it as well. He holds one of the fastest laps of this track in his VP Commodore. If you can get that thing on song, he's going to be right up there. So sports stands are really ones to watch. You've got Group N, who are bringing a huge field as well. The Tiranas often love to slide through turn one, so that's going to be something to see. And then we've got the Kumo V8 touring cars coming. Do you have a standout in that category for those guys? I mean, they're running some of that, I guess, slightly later period cars than you finished running in with supercars.
Yeah, that's right. No, to be honest, I haven't paid probably enough attention to that category. But I think it's a great idea that it gives the cars somewhere to go, and it gives the young guys, you know, a la Luke King, somewhere to step up and have a bit of a look at those cars and a bit of a drive and get a feel for them. So I think it's definitely needed, and it's good use of the machinery that's around.
Well, definitely come out to Muscle Car Masters. You can buy tickets at musclecarmasters.com.au. 28th, 29th of October. Of course, we'll have every session live stream, so you'll be able to watch it all on your phone around the venue, or be able to watch it on the computer or TV at home, because there is plenty to see as well in the back of the pits. They've got some car clubs coming. Todd and the guys behind the scenes, including Luke West, the editor of Muscle Car, Ray Birchhouse, have been working incredibly hard to rejuvenate this year's event. So there's plenty to come and see, including some special announcements that we'll make on the weekend. Peter, you're going to be there. What thing are you probably most looking forward to? Let's just get that one out of your head.
Well, I guess I'll be just flat chat, because I'm the DSO for Heritage Touring Cars, and also my son Grant's racing in sports sedans, and my business partner Simon in sports sedans. So I reckon I'll be flat out getting lunch.
There you go. So I think we will be the same way. There's going to be plenty of action. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter. I'm sure we could have another one of these discussions, and plenty of people would be interested to see some more stories. So we may well have you back in the not too distant future if you're keen and people want to see it. But thank you so much for coming in and having a chat. It's been absolutely amazing.
It's a pleasure, and thanks for having me. And I'm excited to be the first one in this great new studio.
We've christened the studio. Hopefully plenty more to come. Don't forget to buy your Australian Muscle Car Masters merch from musclecarmasters.com.au. Great looking shirts that you can wear with pride. There's some as well. We've got the collared shirt here as well, just before we finish up, that really has a great retro look to it. You'd have to think to be able to wear that one around the circuit. So that's all we've got here for our Muscle Car Masters live show, previewing the event and having a chat to Peter Doulman about his spectacular history with the BMWs, and of course into the supercars era. We hope you've enjoyed it here on Blendline TV. Thank you so much for joining us on the live stream and giving your opinions and thoughts as well, and some of the guys chatting in. We've also got to make special mention to David Trotter, who's a flaggy as well out there. We often don't see enough given to the officials and given back to them. So thank you to them for all of their effort, and we will be having some things to thank them across the weekend as well with Muscle Car Masters. But until next week, I'm Daniel Beckinsale. Thanks for joining us here tonight. Peter Doulman with me. Until then, until we see you next time, I guess, bye for now.
Good night.